This is the Light Brigade, a roguelite VR shooter that takes realistic World War weaponry, throws in magic powers, and sets you loose through procedurally generated worlds as you collect fallen souls and try not to throw your controllers in frustration as you realize just how much you suck at this game. The Light Brigade is out February 22nd for Quest 2, Steam VR, PSVR 1, and yes, oh yes, PSVR 2. This review will be based on both the Quest 2 and PC VR versions of the game, so stick around for a comprehensive review and see if this is worth a day one purchase. Hey guys, it's Chris from the VR Grid and welcome to the channel. Before we get into it, if you like this video, give it a like for us and leave a comment, as it really helps the channel get recognized by the almighty YouTube algorithm. And of course, consider subscribing for future VR content if you aren't already, and for all you beautiful people that already have, maybe check that you have all notifications on, as YouTube loves to mess with that from time to time. And with that housekeeping out of the way, let's get into it. Okay, so I know there's a story here, something about the fall of the world and the rise of an evil obsidian order. You're part of the Light Brigade and must bring light back to the darkness or something like that. Honestly, I found the whole narrative a bit inconsequential, as I really just wanted to shoot things, and that I did a lot of. Oh yes. Jumping into the gameplay side of things, you should know that the Light Brigade is through and through a roguelite, and not an easy one at that. As the default rifleman class, you and your trusty Enfield are sent on your way with little else but an attaboy and a few ammo clips. Through the teleportation gate and off you go. Now, while maps are procedurally generated, the game is broken into a specific order of biomes, each with their own look and design tendencies. Some may be fog-drenched forests, while others may be floating sky levels, while others may take place in castles and caves. It is, however, within these specific biomes that maps will be procedurally generated, changing level design, elevations, enemy numbers, and placements, as well as loot drop placements and the exit gate. Progression through these map levels, as well as your own character class level, will also have a significant impact on maps, altering what types of enemies you encounter, the behavior of said enemies, and the rarity of loot you might find. Borrowing more than a few ideas from the Souls-like genre, killing enemies awards you with their fallen soul. Souls are collected throughout the run and effectively becomes your character leveling XP. That is, if you can live long enough to deposit them at, well, let's just call it a soul kiosk. Each given map is small to moderate in size, and clearing a map of enemies will open up an exit gate. It is at these gates that you will typically find a soul kiosk, however, not always. So staying alive long enough to clear a map, open up the gate, and hopefully get a soul kiosk can certainly amp up the level of risk-reward tension. However, death is not necessarily the end of a run, as players are equipped with an extra life, with more being an upgrade option later on. In a very Souls-like fashion, upon death, players are placed at the beginning of the map, weapons in hand and tasked with surviving to their fallen corpse and praying to it in order to raise it back to life. If successful, the run continues. But these lives are limited, and once you are out, your run is over, leaving any souls you might have acquired and not deposited into a kiosk lost forever. And back to the Light Brigade base you go. After a few runs and you've leveled up the Rifleman class a bit, the game will open up, allowing players to now upgrade that class, or, once hitting level 5, try out the next unlocked class. There are 6 classes in total, and each with their own weaponry loadout and magic ability. Yes, magic. This is something that also opens up early on and can be upgraded as well. Equipping players with a magic wand of sorts, this wand powers up over time and allows players to unleash magical abilities while in combat, and differ depending on what class you play as. Now honestly, this is something I didn't use that much early on, but as I began to get further into the game and it progressed in difficulty, yes, now I use it a lot more. Now as a shooter, the Light Brigade is fairly competent, often feeling like it takes the gunplay from something like Contractors or Pavlov, requiring players to manually reload and chamber weapons while also learning the gun's characteristics. It then takes that and thrusts it into the more Souls-like combat of something like In Death. Now, what I mean by that is enemy NPCs often remain at their posts in-game until aggroed by a player, either by directly attacking them, alerting them through close proximity, or attacking a nearby NPC. In this type of AI behavior, maps are turned into much more strategic endeavors, encouraging players to choose their attack point, plan for cover, and strategize an attack plan to clear the map without being overwhelmed. As such, I did find that the game favored more ranged attacks, making classes outside the rifle class that favored more close-range weaponry much more challenging, often requiring a very different playstyle than the one I naturally lean towards. Enemy AI may start fairly dumb, essentially standing in place and shooting, but trust me, as you begin to level up a class, they demonstrate some very capable AI, not only spreading out and taking cover, but taking flanking positions while also using the same teleportation ability that you use to change vertical positions or move quickly. The latter of which I loved and hated in almost equal measure, as it seemed unfair of them to use my tricks, while also being completely fair at the same time. Enemies also begin to hit hard, use shields, and often will send companions like dogs and birds out to hit you from behind cover. In fact, once you get past the game's initial class levels, the combat becomes downright brutal at times, making this a game for those who enjoy the steep difficulty of games in the Souls-like and roguelite genres. This is a game that is designed to break you until you're good enough and level up enough to make it to the end. Fortunately, to help you in your fight against the enemy during your runs, you will come across a variety of loot, both dropped from downed enemies and found in boxes, chests, and breakable urns throughout the game's maps. The most common pickups will come in the form of ammo and coins, the latter of which can be used later in a given run at specific breakpoints, and spent at vendors for various upgrades and consumables, but more on those breakpoints in a minute. Loot pickups may also include consumables such as health, grenades, a personal decoy, or more rare items like weapon attachments or tarot cards. Upon being awarded a tarot card, players are asked to pick from one of 3 cards, which when chosen applies a permanent buff for the entirety of that given run. A player can carry many cards at one time, some even being stackable, allowing players to further customize their given playstyle. Now, those breakpoints I mentioned. In true roguelite fashion, your run will include a handful of boss fights. After beating a boss fight, you will find a breakpoint or hub world, if you will. Now, upon death, you won't be able to simply spawn back to this hub, but this will become your new starting point for future runs with that class, essentially giving you a bookmark of sorts to move on from. The game loop is tried and true roguelite with a permadeath system that is more Souls-like than roguelite. Gunplay is punchy and sophisticated, and the enemy AI is difficult and often demonstrates properly the intelligence part of AI. Unfortunately, the gunplay sometimes gets in its own way, with some VR mechanic implementation that often had me fighting the game, especially when things got frantic. To start off, the movement speed is incredibly slow when two-handing any weapon. Unlike a traditional military shooter that only throttles your movement speed when raising the gun up to aim, movement here is always slow when two-handing a two-handed weapon, regardless of how you hold it. The result is a literal crawl speed unless you drop your non-dominant hand, which, despite just feeling weird, also forces the player to forego being at the ready in order to essentially walk. Further to this, there is no run, as that is replaced by the game's reliance on teleportation, a mechanic I wish was relegated simply to jumping from different platforms and elevation, where it works just fine. Additionally, for those who prefer to play seated and not crouch behind cover physically, the game put the crouch button on both the L3 and R3 stick buttons, making for a lot of accidental crouches when my muscle memory of pushing the L3 stick to run kicked in. Further to this, the teleportation is activated by pushing the R3 stick forward, so you can begin to see how accidental teleportation and crouching could become a real pain. Of course, over time I would learn this, but the implementation here really could use some tweaking. Furthering my frustration is the ammo belt, as it is simply too wide, often being in the way, especially when playing seated, but not exclusively. Additionally, the belt direction does not stay facing the direction I turned in, seeming to be connected to my head instead of my body direction. Now, it eventually does reset, but the result was many times in combat reaching for my magazine only to find the belt off kilter and not where it needed to be, or stuck inside a rock that I was taking cover behind. Thankfully, all these grievances are ones that could be fixed in a future patch, but combined, I would be lying if I didn't say that often I felt I was simply fighting the game's basic mechanics for most of my playtime. Now, it didn't kill the game for me, but given the quality of gameplay around it, I found it frustrating that I couldn't just enjoy the game. Now, moving on to the graphics side of things, the Light Brigade has a definite art style to it, and one that might feel familiar to those who have played the flat games Ashen or The Long Dark. Like those games, the Light Brigade has an almost watercolor art style that is draped in atmosphere and fog. Yes, there's a lot of fog. However, the game does utilize the fog and limited draw distance in an interesting way, often presenting enemies off in the distance as simple silhouettes. In some games, this could easily be seen as a game just covering up its visual shortcomings, but here in the Light Brigade it really works, adding to the game's chosen art style. Now, you would think that given the chosen art style of the Light Brigade, it would be a perfect fit for the lower powered Quest 2. However, visually, the Quest 2 is a noticeable step down visually from the PC version, with an overall lower resolution, an unreliable frame rate that stutters at times, and some fairly aggressive texture popping, the latter of which also surprisingly plagued the PC version, but to a much lesser extent. The Quest 2 version is definitely playable though, with enemies off in the distance still being retained, so as not to break the gameplay. However, it just feels a little less polished than its PC counterpart. As for the PSVR 2 version, I would expect it to look like the PC version, which played silky smooth and boasts some greatly improved lighting effects as well. Gun models are only okay, breaking a bit from the game's art style and going for a more realistic look. They won't win any awards for gun modeling, but they get the job done. On the sound front, the Light Brigade mostly excels. Like its art style, it goes for an artistic less is more approach, opting for text dialogue instead of voice actors, but making up for this with a very nicely done musical score that really supports the game's visuals in creating a sort of medieval dream world vibe. Gun sounds are like the gun's visual designs, only okay, coming off serviceable but not in the same league as some of the other military shooters. That being said, the guns are punchy sounding, something that is a real sticking point for me in shooters. And the game does an excellent job with its positional audio, allowing for easy location of incoming attacks, something that is definitely crucial in a game of this nature. And that brings me to my final thoughts and review score. I love roguelikes, roguelites, souls-likes, and anything in between. They are video game crack to me, as I love the increased difficulty and the addicting game loop. When looking at VR, we have had a few gems in the form of Compound, In Death, Cosmodread, and The Persistence. And yes, I would put the Light Brigade in that short list, as it offers a very addicting and memorable experience that is only slightly held back by some irritating control mechanics, which I hope are patched after further community feedback. Regardless, it's still a first-rate time in VR, and the VR Grid gives the Light Brigade an 8 out of 10. Looking to the rapidly approaching PSVR 2 launch, for many the Light Brigade is a possible launch day purchase, and while it may get lost in the mix with the likes of some of the more marquee titles, if it can get some of those rougher game mechanics worked out before launch, it may be the surprise launch title that keeps players away from some of those bigger AAA titles. Anyways guys, that's it from us. If you like this video, please hit that like button, subscribe if you aren't already, and as always, I'll catch you on the next video.